Wyoming Territory, 1886. The sun beat down mercilessly on the parched earth of Thunder Basin, illuminating the lone figure of Samuel Vance as he stood on the porch of his modest ranch house. At 25, Samuel had already lived several lifetimes worth of struggle. His lean, muscular frame spoke of daily physical labor, while his striking blue eyes held the weight of responsibilities few men twice his age had shouldered. He squinted toward the distant hills, his light stubble catching the golden afternoon light. The ranch wasn't much, a small house, a decent barn, and enough grazing land for his modest herd, but it was his. More importantly, it was theirs. "Pa, Millie won't give back my book." 8-year-old Thomas came barreling around the corner of the house, his face flushed with indignation. "She said I could borrow it." 6-year-old Millicent appeared moments later, clutching a worn copy of Robinson Crusoe to her chest, her blonde braids flying behind her. Samuel sighed, running a hand through his wheat-colored hair. "Thomas, let your sister finish with it. Millie, you need to ask properly next time." The children, neither his by blood but his in every way that mattered, scampered back to their play as Samuel returned to his thoughts. 3 years a widower and 4 months since their last housekeeper had quit. 4 housekeepers in 3 years, each one overwhelmed by the isolation or the responsibility of helping with 2 rambunctious children. The truth was as stark as the Wyoming landscape. The frontier was no place to raise children alone. A man needed a wife for that, and Samuel had sworn he'd never marry again after losing Elizabeth in childbirth, along with what would have been their first baby together. The pain had nearly broken him. Only the responsibility of raising Elizabeth's children from her first marriage had kept him functioning. But now, watching Thomas and Millie grow wilder by the day, Samuel had to face facts. He needed help. The children needed a mother's touch. What he wanted was to be left alone with his grief and his memories. What they needed was something else entirely. Tomorrow, he would ride into Clearwater and find a solution, somehow. Violet Kaplan stepped off the stagecoach in Clearwater, Wyoming Territory, her legs wobbly from the 3-day journey. At 22, she had never traveled so far from her Philadelphia home, and the vastness of the Wyoming sky made her feel small and exposed. She smoothed down her navy blue traveling dress, now creased and dusty from the journey, and adjusted her matching hat over her dark brown hair, which was coming loose from its careful arrangement. Taking a deep breath, she reminded herself why she had come. There was nothing left for her in Philadelphia after her parents' deaths and her fiancé's betrayal. Teaching positions were scarce back east, but frontier towns were desperate for educated women. Independence, that was what she wanted, what she needed, to prove to herself and to the ghost of William's rejection that she could stand on her own 2 feet, that she didn't need a man's protection or validation to make something of her life. The schoolhouse waited, and with it a fresh start. Miss Kaplan, a portly man with a gray walrus mustache, approached, hand extended. "I'm Mayor Holbrook. Welcome to Clearwater." Violet smiled, taking his hand. "Thank you, Mayor. I'm eager to begin my duties." "Wonderful, wonderful. Mrs. Holbrook is waiting to show you to your accommodations." He gestured toward a severe-looking woman standing near the general store. "School term begins in 3 weeks, which should give you time to settle in and prepare." As the mayor led her across the dusty street, Violet noticed a tall, handsome man emerge from the mercantile, 2 children trailing behind him. Something about his bearing caught her attention, a quiet authority, a watchfulness. Unlike many of the men lounging around the town, he appeared clean and well-kept, though his clothes were worn and practical. Their eyes met briefly across the street, and Violet felt an unexpected jolt. She quickly looked away, reminding herself firmly of her resolution. She hadn't come west to find a husband, she'd come to find herself. Samuel watched the young woman crossing the street with the mayor. Even from this distance he could tell she wasn't from around these parts. Her clothes, though dusty from travel, were too fine, too fashionable. Her posture too straight, her movements too deliberate. City folk, no doubt. "Who's that lady, Pa?" Millie asked, tugging at his hand. "Must be the new schoolteacher," Samuel replied, loading the last of their supplies into the wagon. "You'll meet her when school starts." She's pretty, Thomas observed with the forthright assessment of an 8-year-old. Samuel couldn't disagree, though he kept the thought to himself. Instead, he helped the children climb into the wagon and checked his pocket watch. 3 more stops before they could head home. The blacksmith to check on his order, the post office, and, most important, finding someone willing to come out to the ranch as a housekeeper. His last inquiry at the church had yielded no candidates. The women of Clearwater were either married or unwilling to take on the challenge of an isolated ranch with 2 children. He'd even considered placing an advertisement for a mail-order bride, but the idea left a bitter taste in his mouth. How could he promise love and companionship when he had nothing left to give? The blacksmith had bad news. The parts Samuel needed wouldn't arrive for another 2 weeks. The post office had no mail, and Mrs. Greaves at the boarding house confirmed what he already knew: there were no women seeking domestic positions. "Mr. Vance," she said apologetically, "you should consider remarrying. Those children need a mother and you need a wife." It's been 3 years since Elizabeth passed. Samuel felt the familiar tightness in his chest at the mention of his late wife. "I'm aware of how long it's been, Mrs. Greaves." The older woman softened. "I know it's not what you want to hear, Samuel, but sometimes what we want and what we need are different things." Samuel tipped his hat and left without responding. He was loading the children back into the wagon when he noticed the schoolteacher again, now standing alone outside the general store, consulting a small notebook. Something in her solitary figure called to him, a sense of purpose perhaps, or simply the novelty of a new face in their small community. Before he could second-guess himself, Samuel walked toward her. "Ma'am, pardon the interruption. I'm Samuel Vance. These are my children, Thomas and Millicent." She looked up, startled. Up close she was even lovelier: warm brown eyes, smooth skin with a light dusting of freckles across her nose, and full lips that curved into a cautious smile. "Violet Kaplan," she replied, extending her hand. "The new schoolteacher." Samuel shook her hand, noting how small and soft it felt compared to his calloused palm. "Welcome to Clearwater, Miss Kaplan. These 2 will be in your classroom come September." "Hello," Violet said to the children, her smile warming. "I look forward to having you both as students." Thomas shuffled his feet shyly, but Millie beamed. "Do you know stories, Miss Kaplan? Our last teacher knew lots of stories." "I know quite a few," Violet replied. "Perhaps you can tell me your favorites when school begins." Samuel cleared his throat. "We won't keep you, Miss Kaplan. I'm sure you're busy getting settled." She nodded. "It's a pleasure to meet you all." As they walked back to the wagon, Samuel found himself glancing back. Miss Kaplan had returned to her notebook, but something about her lingered in his mind. He shook it off. He had more pressing concerns than the new schoolteacher. Violet's first 2 weeks in Clearwater passed in a blur of preparations. She arranged her small quarters behind the schoolhouse, developed lesson plans, and gradually met the townspeople. She learned that Clearwater had grown from a trading post to a respectable town of about 400 souls, with ranches and homesteads scattered across the surrounding countryside. She also heard about Samuel Vance, the young widower who ran the Broken Arrow ranch some 10 miles outside of town. The gossip was mostly sympathetic: how he'd married Elizabeth Winters, a young widow with 2 small children, only to lose her in childbirth less than a year later. How he'd stepped up to raise her children as his own, how he struggled to keep housekeepers due to the ranch's isolation. Violet tried not to dwell on these stories. She had her own challenges to focus on, including some of the school board members' doubts about her youth and inexperience. On a sunny Monday afternoon, Violet was arranging books on the schoolroom shelves when a knock at the door startled her. She turned to find Samuel Vance standing in the doorway, hat in hand. "Mr. Vance," she said, surprised, "what brings you to town today?" "Miss Kaplan," he nodded politely. "I came to ask a favor if I might." Curious, Violet set down the books. "Of course." Samuel looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight. "I understand you're boarding with Mrs. Holbrook until the school term begins." "That's right," Violet confirmed, wondering where this was leading. "I'm in need of a housekeeper," Samuel said directly. "Someone to help with the children and the household while I manage the ranch. It's too much for me alone, and I've had no luck finding anyone in town willing to take the position." Violet blinked, beginning to understand. "Are you asking if I know someone who might be interested?" "I'm asking if you would consider taking the position yourself," Samuel said, his blue eyes steady on hers. "Just until school begins. 3 weeks of your time in exchange for good wages." Violet stared at him, momentarily speechless. "Mr. Vance, I'm a teacher, not a housekeeper." "I understand that," he said quickly. "But you're also new to town, with time on your hands before school starts. The children already like you, and it would give them a head start with their education." She hesitated. The offer was unexpected but not entirely unreasonable. Her funds were limited after the journey west, and additional wages would be welcome. "Still, the ranch is quite isolated, I understand," she said carefully. Samuel nodded. 10 miles out, but I'd bring you to town for Sunday services and any time you needed supplies. You'd have your own room, of course, and I'd ensure your reputation remained intact." His jaw tightened slightly. "I'm not looking for anything improper, Miss Kaplan, just help with the children and the house." Violet considered the proposition. It was unorthodox, certainly, but she had come west for new experiences. And truthfully, the idea of seeing more of the Wyoming countryside appealed to her. "I would need Mrs. Holbrook's approval to change my boarding arrangement," she said. Relief flashed across Samuel's face. "I've already spoken with her. She believes it's a sensible arrangement, as long as you're comfortable with it." Violet raised an eyebrow at his presumption but found herself nodding slowly. "Very well, Mr. Vance. I'll accept your offer on one condition." "Name it." "That I may bring my books and continue my lesson preparations during my free time." Samuel's mouth curved into a genuine smile, the first she'd seen from him. It transformed his face, softening the angles and lighting his eyes. "That seems fair, Miss Kaplan. When can you be ready?" "Tomorrow morning." "I'll collect you at 8, he said, settling his hat back on his head. "Thank you, Miss Kaplan. The children will be pleased." As he left, Violet wondered if she'd made a rash decision. 3 weeks at an isolated ranch with a man she barely knew and his 2 children. It certainly wasn't what she'd expected when she came west. But then again, nothing about the frontier had been what she expected. The journey to Broken Arrow Ranch revealed Wyoming's stark beauty to Violet. Rolling grasslands stretched toward distant mountains, broken occasionally by rocky outcroppings or clusters of cottonwoods marking hidden streams. The landscape's vastness made her feel both insignificant and strangely free. Samuel drove the wagon in silence for much of the journey, with Thomas and Millie chattering excitedly from the back. Occasionally, he would point out landmarks or explain aspects of ranching when Violet asked questions. "There's the house," he finally said, gesturing toward a distant structure nestled at the base of a gentle hill. "Not much to look at, but it's solid." As they drew closer, Violet could see a modestly sized 2-story house with a wide porch, a large barn, corrals, and several outbuildings. A small garden plot lay to one side, looking somewhat neglected. "It's lovely," she said sincerely, appreciating the setting if not the obvious signs of a household without a woman's touch. Samuel gave her a skeptical glance but nodded his thanks. The interior of the house confirmed Violet's suspicions, clean enough but disorganized. The main floor consisted of a kitchen, a dining area, a sitting room with a stone fireplace, and what appeared to be Samuel's bedroom. Upstairs were 2 more bedrooms and a small sewing room. "You'll take the sewing room," Samuel explained, carrying her trunk up the narrow staircase. "It's small, but it has a bed. The children's rooms are across the hall." The room was indeed small, but it had a window overlooking the ranch yard and distant hills. A narrow bed, a washstand, and a chair were the only furniture, but it would serve for 3 weeks. "Thank you," Violet said, setting down her carpetbag. "I'll manage quite well here." Samuel lingered in the doorway, looking uncomfortable again. "I should explain the routine. The children wake at 6, breakfast by 7. I'm usually out by sunrise and come in for breakfast, then back out until noon. Dinner at midday, supper in the evening. The children help with chores, gathering eggs, feeding the chickens, weeding the garden." Violet nodded, making mental notes. "And your expectations for the house?" "Just keep it running," Samuel said, gesturing vaguely. "Meals, laundry, the usual. I don't expect perfection, Miss Kaplan. Just help with the children and some order to things." "I can manage that," Violet said, more confidently than she felt. Her domestic skills were adequate but untested on this scale. "Though I should warn you, I'm a better teacher than cook." A ghost of that transformative smile flickered across Samuel's face. "We're used to simple fare, Miss Kaplan. You won't find us complaining." With that, he left her to settle in, and Violet took a deep breath. 3 weeks. She could certainly manage a household for 3 weeks. Samuel found it disconcerting having Miss Kaplan in his house. Not in an unpleasant way, quite the opposite. By the end of her first week, the chaos had receded. Meals appeared on time, the children were cleaner and better behaved, and the house had taken on an order it had lacked since Elizabeth died. What disturbed him was how quickly they had all adjusted to her presence. How Thomas now brought her interesting rocks he found instead of storing them in his pockets until laundry day. How Millie followed her around, chattering about dolls and stories. How even he found himself lingering at the table after meals, drawn into conversations about books or the children's progress. Miss Kaplan, Violet, as he'd begun to think of her, though he maintained formality in their interactions, was not what he'd expected. She was educated and refined, yes, but also practical and surprisingly adaptable. When the pump handle broke, she'd helped him fix it without complaint, her sleeves rolled up and hair escaping its pins as they worked together in the yard. And she was good with the children. Not just patient, but genuinely interested in them, in drawing out their thoughts and encouraging their curiosity. In the evenings, she read to them from her collection of books or taught them simple mathematics and geography at the kitchen table. It was during one such evening, as Samuel sat ostensibly reviewing cattle records, but actually watching the three of them bent over a map of the United States, that he felt something shift inside him. A crack in the wall he'd built around his heart, a dangerous possibility. He pushed the feeling away. Miss Kaplan was their temporary housekeeper and the children's future teacher, nothing more. In less than 2 weeks she would return to town and their lives would go back to what? The chaos and loneliness that had become normal. Samuel stood abruptly, causing 3 heads to turn his way. "Just getting some air," he muttered, striding out to the porch. The night was cool, stars scattered across the black Wyoming sky like diamond dust. Samuel leaned against the porch railing, breathing deeply. He couldn't allow himself to become attached, couldn't risk that pain again. The door opened behind him and he knew without looking that it was her. "The children are ready for bed," Violet said softly. "They want you to say good night." Samuel nodded without turning. "Thank you, Miss Kaplan." She hesitated, then stepped forward to stand beside him, looking out at the night. "It's beautiful here," she said after a moment. "So vast and open, different from Philadelphia in every way possible." "Do you miss it?" he asked, genuinely curious. "The city, I mean." Violet considered this. "I miss certain conveniences, books mainly, and occasionally proper tea." She smiled slightly. "But there's something compelling about this place, a sense of possibility." Samuel glanced at her, surprised by the sentiment. "Most people see only the hardship." "Oh, I see that too," she assured him. "But also the freedom, the chance to build something meaningful." The word struck Samuel deeply. Building something meaningful, wasn't that what he'd thought he was doing with Elizabeth, before everything collapsed? "Sometimes what we build falls apart," he said quietly. Violet turned to look at him directly, her expression thoughtful in the dim light spilling from the house windows. "Yes," she agreed. "But that doesn't mean we should stop building." Their eyes held for a moment too long, and Samuel looked away first, uncomfortable with the understanding he saw in her gaze. "I should say good night to the children," he said, straightening. Violet nodded, stepping back. "Of course. Good night, Mr. Vance." "Good night, Miss Kaplan." As he headed inside, Samuel tried to ignore the warmth her presence had kindled. 2 more weeks, and things would return to normal. He would make sure of it. The incident with the rattlesnake happened 3 days later. Violet was hanging laundry in the yard, the children helping by handing her clothes from the basket, when she heard the distinctive rattle. Freezing mid-motion, she scanned the ground and spotted the snake coiled near the clothesline post, not 3 feet from where Millie stood. "Don't move," Violet said softly, her heart pounding. "Thomas, Millie, stay absolutely still." The children obeyed instantly, fear widening their eyes as they spotted the snake. Calculating distances, Violet realized she could reach Thomas easily, but would have to step closer to the snake to grab Millie. The rattler's head was raised, tongue flicking, disturbed by their presence. "Thomas," she whispered, "when I count to 3, I want you to step very slowly backward, then run to the house. Get your father." "But Millie," the boy protested. "I'll protect Millie. Go carefully now. 1, 2, 3. Thomas followed her instructions perfectly, stepping back, then darting toward the house. The movement agitated the snake further, its rattle intensifying. "Millie, sweetheart," Violet said, keeping her voice steady. "I'm going to reach for you. When I do, I want you to let me pick you up. Don't make any sudden movements." The 6-year-old nodded almost imperceptibly, her small face white with terror. Violet inched forward, stretching her arm toward the child. The snake's rattle grew more frantic. Just as her fingers closed around Millie's arm, the rattler struck. Violet yanked Millie away and felt a burning pain as the snake's fangs sank into her calf instead. She gasped but managed to swing Millie away from danger, nearly throwing the child clear of the snake. "Run, Millie," she cried, stumbling backward herself as the snake recoiled for another strike. The sound of boots pounding across the yard registered dimly as pain radiated up her leg. Then Samuel was there, shotgun in hand. The blast was deafening as he dispatched the snake. "Miss Kaplan," he was beside her in an instant, catching her as her leg buckled. "Were you bitten?" Violet nodded, vision swimming. "My calf." It was going for Millie. Samuel's face went grim as he scooped her into his arms. "Thomas, bring my saddlebags from the barn, the medicine kit inside. Millie, get water boiling on the stove." The children ran to obey as Samuel carried Violet into the house and placed her on the sofa. With swift, efficient movements, he cut away her stocking to expose 2 puncture wounds, already swelling and turning an angry red. "This will hurt," he warned, taking out his knife. Before Violet could process his meaning, he had made a quick, shallow cut across the bite marks and was pressing around the wound, forcing blood and venom to flow out. Violet bit back a cry, digging her fingers into the sofa cushions. "You're doing well," Samuel assured her, his voice steady even as his eyes betrayed his concern. "The bite's not deep, and I'm getting the venom out." Thomas burst in with the saddlebags, and Samuel quickly extracted a small bottle. "Whiskey," he explained, "to clean it and help with the pain." The liquid burned like fire when he poured it over the wound. This time, Violet couldn't suppress her cry. "I'm sorry," Samuel murmured, now wrapping her leg with a clean bandage from his kit. "We need to keep the leg still and lower than your heart." He placed a cushion under her foot. "The venom's not usually fatal in adults, but it'll make you sick." Violet nodded weakly, cold sweat breaking out across her forehead as nausea swept through her. "The children." "They're fine. Millie says you pushed her out of the way." Samuel's hands paused in their work, and he looked up at her face, his expression intense. "You put yourself between my child and a rattlesnake." "I couldn't let her get hurt," Violet said simply. Something flickered in Samuel's eyes, gratitude, admiration, and something deeper she couldn't name. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know how to repay that." "No repayment necessary," Violet managed, before another wave of nausea and dizziness washed over her. Samuel noticed immediately. "You're going to feel worse before you feel better. The venom needs to work through your system." He brushed a strand of hair from her damp forehead. "I'll stay with you." And he did. Through the long afternoon and into the evening as fever and chills racked her body, Samuel remained at her side. He bathed her face with cool cloths, helped her sip water, and spoke soothingly when the pain made her whimper. The children hovered anxiously until Samuel sent them to bed with assurances that Miss Kaplan would recover. In her more lucid moments, Violet was acutely aware of Samuel's gentle hands and worried eyes. Once, when a particularly bad wave of pain hit, he held her hand, letting her squeeze it until the spasm passed. "You're the strongest woman I've ever met," he told her as dawn broke and her fever finally began to subside. "Most would have been screaming with a bite like that." Violet managed a weak smile. "I was raised not to make a fuss." Samuel shook his head, a hint of his rare smile appearing. "Stubborn, too." As morning light filled the room, Violet fell into an exhausted sleep, vaguely aware of Samuel adjusting the blanket over her before he moved away. For Samuel, the rattlesnake incident changed everything. Watching Violet writhe in pain from a bite meant for his daughter had torn something open inside him, a feeling he'd thought buried with Elizabeth. The realization terrified him. For 3 days he kept Violet on the sofa, refusing to let her return to her duties despite her protests once the worst symptoms subsided. He tended to her himself between ranch work, awkwardly preparing meals and organizing the children as best he could. "You're hovering, Mr. Vance," Violet finally said on the 4th morning, sitting up with more color in her cheeks. "I assure you, I'm well enough to return to my room upstairs." Samuel frowned. "The doctor said to keep the leg elevated and avoid stairs." "The doctor also said I was healing remarkably well," Violet countered. "And while I appreciate your care, I'm uncomfortable monopolizing your sitting room." Samuel recognized the stubborn set of her jaw and knew argument was futile. "At least let me help you upstairs." Before she could protest, he swept her into his arms for the 2nd time that week. Violet gasped, automatically wrapping her arms around his neck. "This is hardly necessary," she objected, though her voice lacked conviction. "Humor me," Samuel replied, carefully navigating the narrow staircase. Carrying her was different this time. No panic or urgency, just an acute awareness of her warmth against his chest, the scent of lavender in her hair, the way her body fit against his. Samuel concentrated on each step, trying to ignore the quickening of his pulse. In her room, he set her gently on the bed, lingering perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. Their faces were close, and for a breathless instant, Samuel found himself wondering how her lips might taste. The thought jolted him back to his senses. He straightened abruptly. "Call if you need anything. Thomas and Millie will check on you." Violet looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Mr. Vance." Samuel retreated to the safety of ranch work, throwing himself into physical labor to quiet his troubling thoughts. He had no business thinking of Violet Kaplan that way. In a week she would return to town to start the school term. Their arrangement had always been temporary. That evening, he found Violet at the kitchen table despite his instructions to rest, helping the children with their reading. "Miss Kaplan," he said, disapproval evident in his tone. She met his gaze steadily. "Mr. Vance, I cannot lie abed while there's work to be done. My leg is much improved." To demonstrate, she stood, putting weight on the injured leg. She winced slightly but remained standing. Samuel sighed, recognizing defeat. "At least let the children fetch things for you." "Agreed," Violet said with a small smile of victory. "Now, would you like coffee?" Thomas was just about to put the kettle on. Somehow, despite Samuel's continued protests, Violet resumed most of her duties over the next few days, though he noticed she took more frequent rests and allowed the children to help more than before. He found himself watching her constantly, alert for signs of fatigue or pain, ready to intervene if she overtaxed herself. He told himself it was concern for her recovery, nothing more. The lie grew thinner each day. The night before Violet was scheduled to return to town, a summer thunderstorm swept across the range. Wind howled around the house, rain lashed the windows, and lightning split the sky in jagged bursts, followed by teeth-rattling thunder. The children, frightened by the storm's ferocity, had finally fallen asleep in Samuel's bed after much reassurance. He'd planned to spend the night in the sitting room but found Violet still awake, staring out the kitchen window at the tempest. "Can't sleep?" he asked, pausing in the doorway. She turned, and the dim light of the oil lamp caught the gleam of tears on her cheeks. Alarmed, Samuel stepped forward. "Violet, are you in pain?" She shook her head, quickly wiping her face. "No, I'm fine, just thinking about tomorrow." Understanding dawned. "You're sad about leaving." "Foolish, isn't it?" she said with a forced laugh. "I've only been here 3 weeks." "But the children," she trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "They'll miss you too," Samuel said quietly, moving to stand beside her at the window. "We all will." The admission cost him something, but in the storm's wild energy, with her imminent departure looming, honesty felt necessary. Violet looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "Samuel," she said, using his given name for the first time, "these weeks have meant something to me, more than I expected." The sound of his name on her lips undid the last of his restraint. Samuel reached out, brushing a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "They've meant something to me, too." Her skin was soft beneath his calloused fingers. When she didn't pull away, he let his hand cup her cheek, heart pounding as she leaned slightly into his touch. "I never thought," he began, then stopped, unsure how to express the tumult of feelings she'd awakened. Thunder crashed directly overhead, making them both jump. The moment broke, and Samuel reluctantly lowered his hand. "You should rest," he said, stepping back. "Tomorrow will be a long day." Violet nodded, her expression a mixture of disappointment and understanding. "Good night, Samuel." As she moved past him toward the stairs, lightning illuminated the kitchen in a brilliant flash, and Samuel caught her arm, suddenly unable to let her go. "Violet, wait." She turned back, questioning. He struggled to find the words to voice the realization that had been building for days. "I don't want you to leave." The simple truth hung between them as the storm raged outside. "I have obligations," Violet said softly. "The school, the children of Clearwater." "I know," Samuel acknowledged, "but perhaps there could be an arrangement. You could teach during the weekend. Return here on weekends." It was an impulsive suggestion, impractical in many ways, but he couldn't bear the thought of the house emptying of her presence entirely. Violet's eyes widened. "That would cause talk, Samuel." A single woman staying at a widow's ranch, even part-time. She was right, of course. Wyoming might be more progressive than eastern states in many ways, but certain proprieties were still observed. "Unless," Samuel hesitated, the idea forming even as he spoke, "unless you weren't a single woman." Violet went very still. "What are you saying?" Samuel took a deep breath. The words, unplanned and unbidden, rose to his lips. "Marry me," he said simply. "You already know the children, they adore you, and he faltered, then pressed on. "I've come to care for you, Violet, more than I thought possible." Shock registered on her face. "Samuel, we barely know each other." "I know enough," he insisted. "I know you're brave and kind and intelligent. I know the children need you. I know this place feels more like home with you in it." He stepped closer. "I know I'm asking a lot. I'm not offering grand romance or wealth, just a partnership, a family, a life built together." Violet stared at him, speechless. "You don't have to answer now," Samuel continued, suddenly aware of the enormity of his proposal. "Think about it, take all the time you need." Another flash of lightning illuminated her face, beautiful, confused, vulnerable. "Samuel, I came west to be independent, not to become a wife and mother overnight." "You can still teach," he said quickly. "We'd make it work. The ranch is only 10 miles from town." Violet shook her head, not in refusal but in disbelief. "This is unexpected." Samuel almost smiled. "For me as well. I never planned to marry again after Elizabeth." His expression sobered. "But watching you with the children, seeing how you faced danger without hesitation to protect them, I realized some things are worth the risk." He took her hands in his, feeling their slight tremor. "Just consider it, please." After a long moment, Violet nodded. "I will think about it." It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't rejection either. Samuel released her hands and stepped back, allowing her to pass. As she climbed the stairs, he remained in the kitchen, listening to the storm and wondering if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life or offered them all a chance at happiness. The journey to Clearwater the next day was painfully silent. Samuel drove the wagon, his face set in stoic lines, while Violet sat beside him, acutely aware of the unresolved question between them. The children, sensing the tension, were unusually subdued in the back. Violet's thoughts churned. Samuel's proposal had been sincere, she had no doubt, but was it born of genuine feeling or merely practical necessity? And what of her own confused emotions? She'd come to care deeply for him and the children, but was that enough basis for marriage? Marriage had been part of her life plan once before William's betrayal. She'd envisioned a proper courtship, a respectable engagement, a future with a man she'd grown to love over time. Samuel was offering something entirely different, marriage first, with the hope that deeper love might follow. It was terrifying. And yet, the thought of saying goodbye permanently to Thomas and Millie made her heart ache. And Samuel. There was something about him that called to her. His quiet strength, his dedication to the children, the rare moments when his guard lowered and she glimpsed the man beneath the widower's grief. "We're here," Samuel announced as they reached the edge of town. Violet looked up, startled to realize they'd arrived. "Oh, yes." Samuel pulled the wagon to a halt outside Mrs. Holbrook's house, where Violet would stay until moving into the teacher's quarters behind the schoolhouse. He helped her down, then unloaded her trunk and carpetbag while the children watched solemnly from the wagon. "Well," he said awkwardly, setting her belongings on the boardwalk, "I suppose this is goodbye for now." Violet nodded, suddenly finding it hard to speak. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Vance. And please thank the children again for their help during my recovery." Samuel's jaw tightened at her return to formality. "Violet." "There you are, Miss Kaplan," Mrs. Holbrook called, emerging from her house. "I was beginning to worry." Come in, you must be exhausted." Violet hesitated, looking back at Samuel and the children. Thomas was clearly fighting tears, while Millie had buried her face in her brother's shoulder. "I'll visit soon," she promised them. "And I'll see you at school in a few days." Samuel nodded stiffly. "Good day, Miss Kaplan." As he drove away, Violet felt as though something precious was slipping through her fingers. But what choice did she have? She couldn't make such a life-altering decision based on 3 weeks' acquaintance and confused feelings. Could she? Samuel threw himself into ranch work over the next few days, trying to ignore the gaping hole Violet had left in their lives. The house seemed emptier, the meals tasteless, the evenings endless without her presence. The children were miserable. Thomas had become sullen and withdrawn, while Millie burst into tears at the slightest provocation. Their behavior only reinforced Samuel's conviction that he'd done the right thing in proposing, however impulsively. Now he just had to convince Violet of that fact. On Sunday, they drove to town for church services. Samuel had cleaned up more carefully than usual, trimming his stubble and wearing his best shirt. The children, too, were scrubbed and neatly dressed, though their expressions remained glum. "Will Miss Kaplan be at church, Pa?" Millie asked as they approached Clearwater. "I expect so," Samuel replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Are you going to ask her again to marry you?" Thomas asked bluntly. Samuel nearly pulled the wagon to a halt in shock. "You heard that." Thomas nodded solemnly. "We both did. We weren't really asleep that night. The thunder was too scary." Samuel sighed, wondering what else they might have overheard. "That's between Miss Kaplan and me, Thomas." "But we want her to say yes," Millie insisted. "We want her to be our new ma." The simple statement pierced Samuel's heart. He'd been so focused on his own confused feelings that he hadn't fully considered how much the children had already accepted Violet as a maternal figure. "I know you do," he said gently. "But it has to be her choice." They arrived at the church to find most of the town already gathered. Samuel helped the children down from the wagon, scanning the crowd for Violet. He spotted her standing near the entrance with Mayor and Mrs. Holbrook, looking lovely in a pale blue dress, her dark hair arranged neatly beneath a modest hat. Their eyes met across the churchyard, and for a moment everything else seemed to fade away. Then Mrs. Holbrook said something that required Violet's attention, and the connection broke. Throughout the service, Samuel found his gaze repeatedly drawn to Violet, seated several pews ahead. She appeared composed, attentive to Reverend Parker's sermon, giving no indication of the emotional turmoil Samuel hoped she shared. After the service, as the congregation spilled into the churchyard, Samuel steeled himself to approach her. Before he could move, however, Millie broke away from him and ran directly to Violet, throwing her arms around the young woman's waist. "Miss Kaplan, we miss you so much," the little girl cried. Violet's composure cracked as she knelt to embrace Millie properly. "I've missed you too, sweetheart." Thomas approached more slowly, but accepted Violet's offered hug with visible emotion. Several nearby church members watched the scene with interest, exchanging knowing glances. Samuel finally reached them, acutely aware of the attention they were attracting. "I apologize for the children's exuberance, Miss Kaplan." "No apology necessary, Mr. Vance," Violet replied, rising to her feet, a hint of color in her cheeks. "I'm delighted to see them." An awkward silence fell between them. "How are preparations for school coming along?" Samuel asked finally. "Very well," Violet said. "We have 23 students enrolled so far." "Including us," Millie interjected proudly. Violet smiled down at the child. "Yes, including you and Thomas." More silence, more awkwardness. Samuel searched for something else to say, but his mind had gone frustratingly blank. "Well," Violet said after a moment, "I should return to Mrs. Holbrook's. I have lesson plans to finalize before tomorrow." "Of course," Samuel nodded, disappointment washing over him. "Children, say goodbye to Miss Kaplan." As the children made their reluctant farewells, Samuel found himself unable to meet Violet's eyes. He'd hoped for some sign, some indication that she'd been thinking about his proposal, but she'd given him nothing. Perhaps her silence was answer enough. The first day of school arrived, bringing with it a flurry of activity as Clearwater's children gathered at the newly refurbished schoolhouse. Violet stood at the door, welcoming each student with a smile, trying to memorize names and faces. Her heart quickened when she spotted Samuel's wagon approaching. He helped Thomas and Millie down, gave them each a quick embrace, then stepped back as they ran toward the schoolhouse. "Good morning, Miss Kaplan," Millie called, her earlier sadness apparently forgotten in the excitement of the day. "Good morning, Millie, Thomas," Violet replied warmly. "Find seats inside, please. We'll be starting soon." As the children disappeared inside, Violet found herself face to face with Samuel. He looked tired, she thought, noting the shadows beneath his eyes. "Mr. Vance," she greeted him, conscious of other parents nearby. "Miss Kaplan," he returned with a nod. "The children have been looking forward to this." "As have I," Violet said sincerely. Samuel hesitated, then asked quietly, "May I speak with you privately?" "After school, perhaps." Violet's pulse jumped. "I have a school board meeting immediately after dismissal." "Tomorrow then," he looked so earnest, so hopeful, that Violet felt her carefully constructed defenses weakening. "Tomorrow," she agreed. "The children are dismissed at 3 o'clock." Relief washed over Samuel's face. "I'll be here." Throughout that first day, as Violet organized her classroom and began assessments of her students' abilities, her thoughts repeatedly strayed to Samuel and their impending conversation. She had spent the past week in careful consideration of his proposal, weighing practical concerns against emotional ones, duty against desire. By the time the school day ended on Tuesday, she had reached a decision. Whether it was the right one, only time would tell. Samuel arrived precisely at 3, waiting patiently as the other children dispersed. Thomas and Millie lingered near the schoolhouse steps, clearly aware that something significant was happening. "Why don't you two wait in the wagon?" Samuel suggested. "I need to speak with Miss Kaplan privately." Once the children were out of earshot, Samuel turned to Violet, his expression grave. "I won't take much of your time," he began. "I just wanted to say that I understand if my proposal was unwelcome. It was abrupt and presumptuous. If you wish to forget it entirely, I'll respect that decision and never mention it again." Violet studied his face, seeing the resignation there, the expectation of rejection. "Is that what you want, Samuel, to forget it?" He looked startled by the question. "No," he admitted after a moment. "What I want is for you to say yes, but I recognize that may not be possible." Violet took a deep breath. "These past days away from the ranch, from you and the children, have given me time to think, to consider what I truly want from this new life I've begun." She met his gaze steadily. "I came west seeking independence, yes. But also connection, purpose, a place to belong." Hope flickered in Samuel's eyes. "And have you found those things?" "I believe I have," Violet said softly, "though not entirely where I expected." She stepped closer, gathering her courage. "Your proposal was unexpected, Samuel, but not unwelcome. I've grown to care deeply for Thomas and Millie, and for you." "Violet," Samuel breathed, reaching for her hands. She placed her hands in his, feeling their warmth and strength. "If your offer still stands, my answer is yes, I will marry you." For a moment, Samuel seemed unable to process her words. Then joy transformed his features, erasing the weariness and worry she'd observed earlier. Without warning, he pulled her into an embrace, lifting her off her feet in his exuberance. "Samuel," Violet gasped, laughing despite herself, "people will see." "Let them," he said, setting her down but keeping his arms around her. His expression grew serious again. "Are you certain, Violet, this isn't the conventional path most women would choose?" "I'm not most women," she reminded him with a smile. "And I've never been particularly interested in conventional paths." Her expression softened. "But I am interested in building a life with you and the children, in creating a home together." Samuel's answering smile was radiant. "When?" he asked simply. "The school term ends in December," Violet began, but Samuel shook his head. "Too long," he declared. "October, after the fall roundup." Violet raised an eyebrow at his presumption, but her heart wasn't in the objection. "Very well, October it is." From the wagon, a whoop of joy announced that the children had been watching. They came running back, faces alight with excitement. "Are you going to be our ma now?" Millie demanded, bouncing on her toes. Violet knelt to the child's level, emotion tightening her throat. "If that's what you would like, yes." Millie threw her arms around Violet's neck. "I knew Pa would convince you." Over the child's shoulder, Violet met Samuel's gaze, seeing in it a promise of the future they would build together. Not without challenges, certainly, but with love, respect, and the family they would form from the bonds they'd already begun to forge. October arrived in a blaze of autumn glory, painting the Wyoming landscape in golds and ambers. The ranch house had been transformed as well, with fresh curtains, polished floors, and a general air of renewal that matched the season. Violet stood before the small mirror in what had once been the sewing room, adjusting the lace collar of her wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation of ivory silk that Mrs. Holbrook had helped her make. Her dark hair was arranged in a coronet of braids, adorned with tiny white flowers. A knock at the door preceded Millie's entrance, the child resplendent in a new blue dress, her blonde hair neatly braided and tied with matching ribbons. "Pa says everyone's here, and Reverend Parker is ready," Millie announced importantly. "You look beautiful, miss." She stopped, correcting herself with a shy smile. "You look beautiful, Ma." The word, still new and precious, brought tears to Violet's eyes. "Thank you, Millie." "So do you." Thomas appeared in the doorway, uncomfortable but handsome in his Sunday best. "Pa's getting nervous," he reported with the solemnity of his 9 years. "He keeps straightening his tie and asking if his hair looks all right." Violet laughed, picturing Samuel's uncharacteristic concern about his appearance. "Tell him I'll be down directly." The children scampered off, and Violet took a final look in the mirror. 6 months ago, she had stepped off a stagecoach in Clearwater, determined to forge an independent life. Now she was about to become a wife and mother. The path had been unexpected, but standing here, about to join her life with Samuel's, she had no doubts. Downstairs, the small parlor was crowded with guests, the Holbrooks, Reverend Parker and his wife, Samuel's nearest neighbors, and a few friends from town. Samuel stood by the fireplace, tall and handsome in a new suit, his face cleanly shaven, his wheat-colored hair neatly combed. As Violet descended the stairs, a hush fell over the gathering. Samuel turned, and the look on his face when he saw her, wonder, joy, love, was something Violet knew she would remember for the rest of her life. They joined hands before Reverend Parker, exchanging vows in clear, steady voices. When Samuel slid the simple gold band onto her finger, Violet felt a sense of rightness, of completion. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Parker declared. "Mr. Vance, you may kiss your bride." Samuel's kiss was gentle, but held a promise of passion to come. As they turned to face their guests as husband and wife, Violet caught sight of Thomas and Millie watching with shining eyes. Samuel followed her gaze and nodded slightly. "Children," he said, beckoning them forward. As Thomas and Millie joined them, Samuel placed an arm around each child, drawing them close. "You'll marry me and meet my children," he said softly to Violet, echoing his proposal in a way that acknowledged the family they were forming. "That's what I asked of you, and here we are." Violet reached out to touch each child's cheek, then placed her hand on Samuel's arm, completing the circle. "Here we are," she agreed. "A family." Later, as their guests enjoyed the wedding feast spread on tables in the yard, Samuel pulled Violet aside for a moment of privacy on the porch. "Are you happy, Mrs. Vance?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. Violet smiled up at him, still adjusting to her new name. "Very happy, Mr. Vance." Samuel's expression grew serious. "I know our beginning was unconventional. I asked you to marry me before I properly courted you, before I even told you how I felt." "You've shown me how you felt," Violet assured him. "Actions speak louder than words." "Even so," Samuel insisted, "there are words you deserve to hear." He cupped her face gently between his hands. "I love you, Violet Vance. I never thought I would love again after Elizabeth died, but you brought light back into my life, our lives. You are brave and kind and stubborn, and exactly what this family needed." Tears pricked Violet's eyes at the simple declaration. "I love you too, Samuel. Coming west was the best decision I ever made because it led me to you and the children." Their kiss was interrupted by Thomas calling from the yard, "Pa, Ma. It's time to cut the cake." Samuel smiled against Violet's lips. "Duty calls, Mrs. Vance." "Indeed it does, Mr. Vance," Violet replied, taking his arm, "and I wouldn't have it any other way." Together they rejoined their guests and their children, stepping forward into the life they would build together on the Wyoming frontier. A life of challenges and joys, of hard work and tender moments, bound together by the love that had surprised them both and the family they had found in each other.